The envelope sat in front of me like a quiet threat. My mother pushed it across the white table at the Hawthorne house, her pearl ring catching a cold, unsettling light. Isabel lifted her phone, ready to record the family moment she believed would silence me. The entire restaurant stopped breathing. The violin piece faltered mid-note. I opened the envelope. It wasn't a congratulatory card. It wasn't a message of love. It was a disownment letter, with 3 familiar signatures: my father, my mother, and Isabel. Neat, unshaken, as if they had practiced this for a long time. I didn't speak. I simply folded the paper, feeling the edge graze my skin, just enough to remind me this wasn't a nightmare. They thought this was how they erased me from their story. But what they didn't know was that this moment was actually the opening chapter of the real story. Before I tell you what happened right after I held that paper, tell me where you're watching this video from, and at what time. I read every single comment to know you're still here with me. Now, let's go back to that evening at the Hawthorne house, where they believed they had just extinguished my life, when in reality, they had just triggered something they could never have foreseen. They didn't need to say anything. The way they looked at me was enough to show exactly where I stood in this family. The Ellingtons always knew how to shine, in a way that made me disappear. In Boston, they weren't just wealthy. They knew how to make everyone see they were wealthy. My father, Richard Ellington, walked into any room carrying an authority as cold as steel. People respected him for the number of lawsuits he won, not for his heart. Because, truthfully, there wasn't much room left in it for anything called emotion. My mother, Catherine, was different. She was beautiful and elegant. I spoke just enough, and always smiled at the angle that let the light hit the pearl on her ear. To her, image mattered more than family, especially when a reporter or a museum board member was nearby. And Isabel, my sister, she was the child they invested correctly in. An associate at Beacon and Rowley Capital, perfect in every frame, and always the center of every family story. In family photos, I was always at the edge of the frame. Literally. I once tried to blend into that world. Winter charity galas, my parents' cocktail networking nights, long dinner tables with white lilies and gleaming silverware. Every time I was introduced, my mother would tilt her head and soften her voice as if trying to soothe someone. "This is Isabel, our family's pride." Then she would glance at me. "And this is Mara. She's still studying." Still studying. As if I were an unfinished draft. I had grown used to the guests' looks. A polite smile. A slight nod. Then they returned to their wine and their conversation about major investments. But invisibility had its value. It gave me time to observe and to understand them. 2 days before graduation, my phone buzzed. A message in the family group chat. Pre-graduation dinner. 7 p.m. Hawthorne House. No emoji. No congratulations. Just an order. I opened the reservation link. The line appeared clearly. Ellington family. Richard, Catherine, and Isabel. My name wasn't there. Not a typo. Not a mistake. Not forgetfulness. It was a message. And in that moment, I understood. What they truly wanted to remove wasn't me from the dinner, but me, from their life. Sometimes, you only realize you've been erased from your family when you see yourself disappearing from the photographs. I worked the morning shift at a small cafe near Harvard Square. The espresso machine hissed every dawn, blending with the smell of baked pastries and customers calling out their orders. There, no one knew I was an Ellington. No one cared what school I attended. They just needed hot coffee, the right name, the right temperature. I liked that. It was simple, honest. Nothing like the house where everything was measured by expectations and accomplishments. But every time I finished my shift and returned home, Stepping into the polished wooden living room, I would hear my mother's voice. Soft, but sharp enough to cut. Mara, this coffee-making job, does it help your future in any way? My father wouldn't look at me for longer than 1 second. He would just say, you should invest that time into something more valuable. More valuable. In their eyes. Always meant more like Isabel. So I started doing something they never imagined. I kept everything. From my 2nd year of college, I created a folder called Proof of Existence. In it were every scholarship email I had ever received, letters of praise from professors, photos from conferences I attended, the file of my very first project on optimizing delivery routes, the draft of the algorithm model that later became the Rootwise system. I didn't know why I kept so much, until now. Maybe because I needed a place to remind myself that I wasn't a shadow standing behind Isabel. Some nights I would open that folder, look at every congratulations email, and ask myself, if I didn't save these, would my accomplishments actually exist? In my family, silence often meant erasure. So I wrote, I saved. I created traces, so they couldn't erase me with a simple shake of the head. And then everything became clearer. When the snow began to fall that night, one early winter evening, with Boston covered in snow, I received a notification from Instagram. Isabel Ellington tagged you in a photo. I opened it. It was a family dinner. Warm yellow lights. My mother's perfect smile. My father raising a glass of red wine. Isabel, at the center. Always. I wasn't in the photo. Not because I was cropped out. Not because I stood to the side. I had never been invited. The caption read, Family Night. Feeling grateful. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not angry. Not sad. Just clear. They didn't just forget me. They were living a life where I didn't exist. But everything started to change with one single email. That same night, I received an email from Dr. Dollar Alvarez. Mara, I reviewed your simulation. Rootwise, might be bigger than you think. I sat still in front of the screen. Snow fell outside the window, its white glow reflecting onto my desk. And for the first time in months, I saw hope. Maybe I didn't need to stand in their picture. Maybe I would create a different picture, one they'd never expect to see me in. And I didn't know yet that this email would lead me to a contract worth several $1 million and change my entire life. When silence becomes a familiar language, you begin to hear the things you never dared to face before. My small apartment overlooked the Charles River. That night, the water was dark, reflecting the city lights like shards of cold glass. I sat in the quiet, with only the old radiator breathing out thin warmth. On the table were the documents I had saved over the years. Scholarship emails, professor commendations, the earliest sketches of Rootwise. All of them held my handwriting, but not a single piece had ever appeared on the Ellington family wall. The feeling wasn't anger. Not anymore. It was like a cold breeze passing through a thin coat. Not enough to make me shiver, but enough to remind me I was standing alone. Sometimes, loneliness isn't the absence of people, but the absence of anyone who truly sees you. I remembered the year I was 8, before a major fundraising event. My mother fixed Isabel's hair. Every curl, every clip, every stroke of eyeliner, and I stood behind them, holding the necklace she had told me to bring. I waited, and waited, until the car arrived at the door. Catherine turned away, put a coat on Isabel, and said, "We're late. Let's go." I trailed behind them, still holding the necklace in my hand. No one asked. No one remembered. No one noticed that I was even there. That feeling still remains exactly the same today. But the most painful part wasn't being forgotten. It was realizing I had never been part of their plan. Growing up, I always believed that if I tried harder, stayed quieter, and became more perfect. They would be proud of me. But in Boston that night, looking at the papers spread across my table, I realized for the first time I wasn't the problem. I was simply different. And in the Ellington household, different meant unnecessary. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the city. The subway rumbled softly beneath the ground. The wind whistled through the old window frame. Everything blended into a familiar silence. But this time, it didn't make me shrink. It made me clear. When I opened my laptop, an old email resurfaced in the starred folder. From my mother. Its content was only one sentence. "We didn't forget you. We just prioritized differently." I looked at the screen, and I understood. This wasn't the first time they erased me from their story, but it would be the last. There are days life pushes you right to the edge, not to make you fall, but to show you who truly stands behind you. That morning, when Boston was still covered in a thin mist, I received an email from the university's tech seminar. "Mara, your demo will be included in the official presentation list." I stared at the screen. Not because I was surprised, but because it was the first time someone placed me at the center instead of the margin. The Rootwise inbox also lit up nonstop. Local logistics groups wanted to test my simulation. The metrics were running smoothly, the algorithm clearly reducing delivery time. But in the middle of those notifications, my phone lit up with a message from Isabel. "Dinner tonight. Don't overdo it. You know how Mother wants things. Cold. Clean. More of a reminder than an invitation. Your family doesn't need to yell to make you small. Sometimes, one sentence is quiet enough that no outsider notices anything." A few minutes later, another message from my mother appeared. "Let's keep the evening elegant. No unnecessary attention." No one said it directly, but I understood too well. Unnecessary attention meant me. I set my phone down and took a deep breath. Those words pulled me back to when I was 17, the night before the student honor ceremony. My teacher wanted me to be the speaker. But the next morning, the printed list appeared again. My name had disappeared. No explanation. No apology. That day, my mother only said, "Isabel needs this moment more." I was used to being swapped out like an extra detail. But tonight was different. Because this time, I had something they didn't know about. When you finally learn to stand on your own, the sentences that once hurt you become nothing more than data. I opened my closet. Boston nights were cold, so I chose a light gray blazer, neat and understated. The kind of outfit people couldn't belittle, but couldn't gossip about either. My room was so quiet. The ticking clock sounded like knocking. The desk lamp fell across the Rootwise simulations, making the room look like a miniature strategy office. I tied my hair back and straightened my collar. There was a slight tremble in my hand, but it wasn't because of them. It was because of what I knew was coming. Before closing my laptop, I checked my email one last time. And then, a notification appeared like a line drawn under fate. "Northbridge Logistics requested access to your prototype." I froze for a few seconds. Northbridge, one of the top companies in the region. It was their first time ever approaching a student project. My heart pounded. Not out of fear, but because for the first time, the game was tilting toward me. It turns out, sometimes the scariest moment isn't being abandoned, but realizing you no longer need them. I stepped in front of the mirror. The reflection showed someone even I barely recognized. Calm, sharp, gentle, yet solid. I whispered, as if closing a chapter. If they want to end me tonight, they'll have to see exactly what they missed. I put on my coat, turned off the lights, and stepped out of the apartment. Boston was dark, with cold wind weaving between old buildings. But from tonight on, I was no longer the silent daughter of the Ellington family. I had my own story. and they were about to hear it, in a way they couldn't control. As I pulled the door shut, my phone vibrated. A new email. From Northbridge. Only one sentence. We should talk before your dinner. Sometimes, opportunity doesn't come from the door you knock on, but from the person waiting right downstairs. I had just pulled my apartment door shut, my hand still trembling slightly from the Boston wind rushing into the hallway, when my phone vibrated. Mara Ellington. A man's voice. And low. Steady. I answered. Yes. I'm downstairs. Ethan Hale. Northbridge Logistics. If you have 5 minutes, we should talk before your dinner. I froze. Northbridge. Right now. I pressed the elevator button, feeling a new kind of heartbeat inside my chest. Not frantic, but precise. The kind of rhythm belonging to things that had been calculated long before you ever realized. The doors opened. A man in a long coat stood by the lobby. Brown hair, sharp eyes, but not cold. Thanks for coming down, he said. We reviewed your prototype. The CEO is intrigued. Intrigued. That word alone could turn a cold night into a memorable one. When someone sees your value before your own family does, the feeling is both beautiful and painful. We walked to a small lounge by the Charles River, where warm yellow light cast over the dark water. Ethan opened his briefcase and took out a thin envelope. This is a preliminary letter of intent, he said. Don't be too nervous. This isn't a formal offer. But the current valuation of Rootwise is in the 7-figure range. I swallowed. 7 figures. An amount the Ellingtons never imagined I could generate. Ethan continued. Your algorithm is smart, but what the CEO likes most is the fairness in your root distribution model. It doesn't favor any side and doesn't use risky shortcuts. It's transparent. I let out a small laugh. All my life, I had been called naive for being transparent. And yet now, that very quality held value. You're too quiet, Ethan said. I'm just used to people thinking my work isn't important enough. Ethan looked at me longer than expected. Then this is the moment you stop thinking that. Strangers sometimes see you more clearly than the people who share your blood. Ethan asked, Do you still plan to go to the dinner? I exhaled a thin laugh. Can't avoid it. He leaned back, the light catching the sharp bridge of his nose. Mara, one thing. They don't get to define your value. Not tonight. Not ever. Hearing that felt like someone erased a period that had been placed too early in my life. I nodded. Thank you. Not polite. Not performative. A real thank you. But you never truly understand the weight of recognition until you stand face to face with the memories that once made you small. On the way out of the lounge, the Boston wind cut across my face. And for some reason, I remembered the moment when I was 16. I had won a state-level science research award. I ran home with the certificate. Richard only glanced at it and said, Good. But keep your voice down. Your sister has an interview today. Don't make it about you. A sentence I carried like a scratch that never fully healed. Now, thinking back, I just wanted to hold that 16-year-old girl and tell her, You weren't wrong. You were just born in the wrong house. The bitter truth is sometimes people don't try to make you small. They just try to make someone else bigger. When Ethan left, he shook my hand and said, The CEO will reach out after the dinner. Be ready. Be ready. I immediately opened my phone. An email from Northbridge lit up. Your model shows potential for enterprise-level integration. The CEO will reach out tonight. I read it twice. Not because I didn't believe it, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't need my family to believe in something for it to have value. I stepped into the car. The window reflected my face. Calm. Defined. no longer afraid of being erased from any story. This is the first time. I'm not going to be accepted. I'm going to prove they were wrong. It wasn't the moment they removed me from the family that made that night a turning point. It was the way I stood up, and the way they no longer recognized who I was. The Hawthorne house glowed like a miniature Broadway stage. Chandeliers scattered broken shards of light across the white tablecloths. The violin music was soft but cold, the kind of elegant sound that only made the air sharper. I walked in. The Boston wind still clung to my coat. Isabel looked up, a half-smile forming. Her phone was already raised with the camera on, as if she knew what was about to happen, and wanted to capture every moment of me breaking. Catherine adjusted her wine glass and signaled the server. Richard didn't look at me, his eyes glued to the menu as if he were chairing a board meeting. No one hugged me. No one stood. A farewell ritual had been choreographed. All it needed was the one they intended to sacrifice. They thought they were directing the story, but they didn't know. I had a story of my own now. The server appeared and placed a white envelope right in front of me. Catherine smiled with that frozen politeness. After tonight, each of us will go our separate ways. It's better this way. Isabel angled her camera to get the perfect shot. Richard laced his fingers together. It's for clarity. Mara. Clarity. In the Ellington household, that word always meant, if something is inconvenient, remove it. I opened the envelope. Thick paper, the smell of fresh ink, and signatures sharp as blades. My name was written, not to be acknowledged, but to be erased. Effective immediately. All familial expectations and ties are to be stepped away from permanently. Each word sounded like metal tapping against glass. I folded the paper, placed it gently onto the plate, and said, "Thank you." The entire table froze. Isabel lowered her phone slightly, confused. Richard looked up for the first time. Catherine blinked. They were waiting for me to cry. But the only thing I did was open my handbag. I took out a gray folder, the same shade as the blazer I was wearing, placed it in the center of the table. Richard frowned. "What is that?" I pushed it toward them. "Something that belongs in this conversation." Isabel opened the folder. I heard her inhale sharply. Inside were a letter of intent from Northbridge Logistics Evaluation Notes, marked enterprise-level integration, and the final line, proposed leadership role, Director of Systems Development. No numbers. None needed. Catherine's hands trembled. Richard's face flushed red, his voice rough. "Mara, why didn't you tell us?" I looked him straight in the eyes. For the first time in my life. "You never asked," Isabel stammered. "But this doesn't make sense." "It can't be," I tilted my head. "No. It's not impossible. Just inconvenient for you." And then I realized I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I stood up. The chair scraped softly, just enough to make them all flinch. "This paper," I touched the envelope they had handed me. "You can keep it." Then I placed the gray folder on top of it, stacking it like a period at the end of a sentence. "Because I have a letter of my own." Isabel opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. Richard tried to speak but choked on his words. Catherine just stared at me, not with her usual pride, but with a fear I had never seen in her before. "Mara, wait. We can talk about this." I shook my head softly. "No. Because there was never a conversation. Only decisions, and I was always the one paying for them." I turned away. The violin shifted into a lower note, as if the music itself understood what had just happened. I walked out of the dining room, past the curious stares of other guests. Through the glass door, I saw my reflection, no longer blurry, no longer distorted, but defined. My phone vibrated. A new email. From CEO, Northbridge Logistics. Subject: Next steps. Tonight. I tightened my grip on the phone and smiled. That night, no one knew that my silence was the final chapter of an era the Ellington family once controlled. The heavy glass door closed behind me, and the sound of the violin was cut off instantly. Outside, Boston stretched beneath the cold wind, but that air was easier to breathe than any luxurious room I had ever stood in with them. I walked along Beacon Street, faint yellow streetlights, red bricks glistening with water. People rushed past, unaware that I had just left a dinner where my family tried to erase my name from their own story. My phone buzzed the first time. Isabel. I let it ring until the screen went dark. I had chased after them for years, but tonight, my feet no longer moved in their direction. They said my name for the first time, exactly when I no longer needed to hear it. Messages appeared one after another. Catherine, we should talk. Tonight wasn't what you think. Richard, shorter but heavier. We may have misjudged the situation. Misjudged. They didn't say that when I was 16, when my name was scratched off the speaker list. I didn't say it when I received a scholarship they forgot to post on Facebook. Didn't say it when Isabel had every spotlight while I stood at the edge of the frame. They only said it when I stood up. I turned off notifications and slipped the phone into my coat pocket. Not to avoid them. Just because I didn't want to return to the role of the person who always had to explain. Sometimes, growing up simply means learning to let others take responsibility for their own actions. As I approached the Longfellow Bridge, the wind grew stronger. I tightened my coat, about to cross the street when the phone buzzed again. An unknown number. This is Adrian Cole from Northbridge Logistics. I stopped. The sound of traffic behind me seemed to fade. We'd like to meet you tomorrow morning. Route-wise, has the potential to be part of our new strategic structure. His voice was calm, respectful, nothing like the tone I grew up with. I said, "It'll be there." "Good. Tomorrow is a new chapter." His words carried through the wind, and for the first time, I believed it. Back at my apartment, I placed the Disownment envelope on the table. Right beside it, I laid out the printed Northbridge email. 2 pieces of paper, 2 worlds, and I knew I was about to step fully into one of them. I woke up the next morning, no longer feeling like I had to run to keep up with anyone. Light from the Charles River reflected onto my apartment wall. I made coffee, the steam warming my hands. A simple warmth I rarely allowed myself to feel before. My phone stayed still. No more frantic calls. No more late explanations. Only an appointment. Northbridge HQ. 10 a.m. I looked at it and smiled softly. Not because of the project's value, but because this was the first time I was walking into a place where I didn't need permission to exist. Some families only exist to teach us how to build a new one. With ourselves. If you're listening up to this point, I want you to know that no one has the right to define you. Not your parents. Not your siblings. Not the people who underestimated you. Your worth doesn't lie in the recognition they withheld. It lies in choosing yourself, even when the world demands you stay small. I'm sharing this story not for revenge, not for triumph, but to remind someone who's listening, you don't need to become someone else to be worthy. You only need to become yourself, without asking for permission. If this story resonates with you, leave a comment so I know you're still here, listening and understanding. Please like and subscribe so I can share more meaningful and powerful stories with you. See you in the next story.